Colors, post!
Forward, march. Mark time, mark. Colors, hold. Drive, face. Post, colors. Present, hurry. Order, hurry. Left, face. Forward, march.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please remain standing for singing our national anthem by our very own Riverside Chorus.
Right, left, one side, march. Left, right, pizza, hold. Center, face.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bomb bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ready, face. Forward, march.
Let us pray. The message of Christ.
Take heat!
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the President of Riverside Military Academy, Colonel William J. Gallagher. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, one and all, and welcome to each of you on what will undoubtedly be an address that we will remember for a long, long time. I'd like to first recognize some of our special guests today, and each one of you is a special guest, but there's a few visitors from afar I would like to especially recognize. First, Mr. Ira Middleburg. Mr. Middleburg is a Riverside Military Academy alumnus and a former member of our Board of Trustees, a longtime friend and supporter of this school, and a prominent attorney hailing from New Orleans. Mr. Gary Olympic. Mr. Olympic is also a Riverside graduate of the class of 1981 and a prominent attorney based in Atlanta. Gary's mother, Mrs. Judy Olympic. And both the Olympics are lifelong friends of our guest speaker. Mr. Simeon Smith. Mr. Smith is actually a person of many accomplishments. He's an award-winning photojournalist, a filmmaker, and a former anchor on CNN International, probably the most watched news network in the world globally. As a Russian linguist, Mr. Smith was in Tbilisi, Georgia, that's the other Georgia, on an exchange program during the Georgian uprising against the government there back in the late 80s, early 90s. He covered these events live on Soviet television as an American-Russian linguist for Russian TV, at the time Soviet TV, probably the first and only time an American journalist has broadcast live regularly from a crisis point on Soviet television. The documentary that he produced from that experience earned him a prestigious Emmy Award. The film that we're going to see today in a little bit was produced, directed, and scripted by Mr. Smith. Our speaker. Mr. Murray Lynn was born in a small village called Bilka, B-I-L-K-E, Bilka, at the time in Hungary. Today, that area is in Ukraine. In 1942, and up until that time, Mr. Lynn lived an idyllic life with his 3 brothers and his parents. His father was an educated man and a community leader. His mother had been a Hungarian beauty queen at age 19. They owned a small plot of land. His mom made clothes for the local villagers. They had a happy life. However, the year was 1942. Mr. Murray then was 12 years old. One night, Hungarian secret police, fascist police, burst into his house at 2 in the morning, arrested his father, and with other Jewish community leaders marched them to the outskirts of town, into the hills, had them dig their own grave and shot them. In 1944, Mr. Lynn and his family were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most notorious of Nazi concentration camps. Upon his arrival, as we saw, those of us in the Corps of Cadets who saw the video in here the other day, you may recall that just like happened in that video, upon their arrival as a family, Mr. Lynn's mother and his 3 younger brothers were sent to the line with women and children, and they were marched directly into the gas chamber as a family. Mr. Lynn was forced to work 12-hour shifts, long days at construction sites, hauling bags of concrete around. And in mid-January 1945, in the dead of winter, as the Soviet army was about to liberate Auschwitz, the Germans ran, and the few guards that remained forced marched the remaining prisoners on a long and very arduous foot march in the winter from Poland, where Auschwitz is located, back to Germany, to a prison camp in Germany. These were for the able-bodied prisoners. Anyone who fell behind was shot on the spot. These men and women suffered from cold weather, starvation, exhaustion, and extreme exposure during this march. Mr. Lynn survived the march. Many did not. That camp was liberated by American forces in April of 1945, and at the age of 15, the average age of the young people in this room, he returned home to find that his family had not survived. He joined a group of other young orphaned survivors, and as they began to sense the closing of Eastern Europe to the Soviet Iron Curtain, they made their way westward to England, to Ireland, and in Mr. Lynn's case, ultimately to New York City for an education, then to Atlanta to establish his family, begin his profession, and over the coming decades he rose to become the corporate CEO of several multinational corporations based in Atlanta. The word Holocaust comes from the Latin and the Greek. Hol, meaning totality, meaning complete, meaning whole, and kostos, meaning destructive burning. Holocaust, the complete and total destructive burning of a race, of a nationality, of a people. The greatest example of human evil directed against other humans in the history of mankind. Few survived. We have one here today with us. It's our honor to welcome Mr. Murray Lynn, sir.
And good morning to all of you. To say that I'm overwhelmed is a gross understatement. Colonel Gallagher, distinguished faculty, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to this renowned and preeminent institution to share with you a chapter of my life-changing epic saga that defined who I am and what I am today. It's an enduring lesson for the ages. The documentary you're about to see have unchecked power, and I repeat, unchecked power. They are free to terrorize and intimidate minorities, rewrite history to suit their twisted political and ideological agenda, crush those who disagree or those who worship God in a different way. And here is a special message to the students. You are our future leaders. Don't confuse, please don't confuse nationalism with patriotism. They're two different things. The former president of Germany, Mr. Johannes Rau, once said, patriotism can flourish only when racism and nationalism are given no quarter. And I want to repeat this because it's worth remembering. Patriotism can flourish only when racism and nationalism are given no quarter. Then he goes further to define patriotism. A patriot is one who loves his homeland. A nationalist is one who scorns and rejects the homeland of others. I should know. Jews were scorned as foreigners in most of Europe for many centuries. Another way of putting it, those who wrap their nationalist ideologies in the cloak of patriotism don't value or respect the ideas of pluralism and democracy. As I reflect on our bloody history, it has many layers and dimensions. Most of the social and religious pathologies can be retraced to the deeply rooted church doctrine to demonize our faith. From the dawn of Christianity, church leaders masterminded and orchestrated a hate parade against Jews to delegitimize and discredit our faith. We were vilified as Christ killers, sullied as unrepentant sinners, and demonized as corrupt apostates. Stereotyping Jews became a cultural norm in a myth factory of character assassination. The European nations have devolved into a brutal marketplace of abusive human rights in abysmal human lives. The DVD you are about to see will document the consequences of silence. And yes, I repeat, consequences of silence. Too many people were silent when we were herded like sheep to the slaughterhouse. An unchecked power of abuses, which is the bane of all evil. And now, Colonel, we're ready for the film. You are looking at a person who is a living testimony to the Holocaust.
At age 80, Murray Lynn might be expected to spend his days dwelling in the satisfied bliss of many accomplishments. Instead, for our sake, he intentionally relives nightmares almost too horrible for words.
I just want the audience to remember that Auschwitz was the kingdom of death, that it swallowed up the young and the old, the meek and the mighty, the simple and the educated. And I hope that this kingdom of death that we experienced is immortalized for future generations so they will better understand why we must talk about this.
For 11 years, Adolf Hitler dedicated himself and his regime to destroying all of the Jews of Europe. He nearly succeeded. But one survivor said it is not accurate to place responsibility for the Holocaust on this lone villain or even his army of Nazis. He says centuries of hate provided fertile ground for both the Third Reich and the Holocaust.
What happened when Hitler came to power? Hitler, in a way, pierced that facade of silence.
A facade of silence, a hate that lay so close to the surface of European society that when given voice and power, it erupted into unimaginable barbarism. One person who, as a teenager, lost everyone and everything to that hate, believes a facade of silence still lurks, luring us again to slumber. And so he has awakened his own voice to sound the warning.
As I got older, when I turned 70, I came to the realization that my life is not entirely my own. It belongs to a tragic history. And from that, we need to draw some meaning, and we need to draw some direction, and we need to draw some lessons. But most of all, we want to send a message to the world for them to remember the consequences of silence, the consequences of hatred.
Every survivor of the Holocaust provides a unique and personal perspective. As you will learn, Murray Lynn survived not just the camp that slaughtered 1.5 million people, but a terrible trauma prior to his deportation to Auschwitz. But despite all the terror and loss he endured, Murray Lynn not only held on to his life, but also to his humanity.
We all have certain attributes, and I think the greatest attribute that I have is I cannot nurture hatred. All their clothes, their shoes, they had to dump them in one place, and then we were selected whether we're going to work or we're going to die.
He was about the age of these visitors when he entered Auschwitz. But whether Murray Lynn's personal story or even the Holocaust itself is within the grasp of every young mind is unlikely.
The survival rules were never to let the Germans know that you are sick, that you're incapable of performing the slave labor. If you are a fighter, you can overcome adversity. If you're not a fighter, you capitulate, and I was a fighter.
For most of his adult life, hardly anyone was aware of Murray Lynn's past. So his global business achievements, his enduring and happy marriage, his success as a father, while admired, may not have appeared that extraordinary, if only people had known. Even today, at 80-plus years, he remains a disciplined man with a brilliant mind and a unique charm. He just never offered explanations for why he avoided trains or large dogs. Given what we know about the treatment of Europe's Jews before and during World War II, it is hard to believe any survived. But in thousands of places, Jewish survival amidst vastly larger European Christian communities has historically been a profound challenge. And so it was for all the Jews in the Hungarian town of Bielki, including a young man known to friends as Maurice.
We were pretty much isolated from non-Jews. The Christian community did not want to have to do much with us. They did not. We were not integrated in the community. We knew the reasons why. It goes back 1,800 years. The church, for many, many years, had their doctrine was encapsulated in 4 words. Jews are unrepentant sinners. We were treated as infidels, as heretics, and they wanted very little to do with us. And this was a weekly sermon in the church, that Jews killed Christ, that Jews were unrepentant sinners, and we must be treated accordingly as pariahs and isolated. Hating Jews, being intolerant of Jews was part of the DNA of its culture and creed. And there is not very much we can do to change their mindset. So we lived almost in fear. We did not want to argue with these people because we knew it was a no-win game. And so we accepted our fate for many, many centuries as being the underclass.
Some elements of the Christian church did protest Nazi treatment of Jews and other minorities. Those efforts were brutally suppressed. More commonly, however, widespread church indifference and even support for the Nazi policies existed in many parts of Europe. So what began in the early 30s with vile propaganda evolved with shocking haste into isolation, brutalization, deportation, and the systematic slaughter of Europe's Jews. And again, while Hitler provided the face for these acts, tens of thousands willingly carried out his orders, while millions passively ignored unmistakable indications of the ongoing crimes.
Hitler emboldened those people. He encouraged them when they realized that they can speak freely because it came from other powers. It emboldened them to be more anti-Semitic, and it encouraged them to call us names. It encouraged them to taunt us. It encouraged them to mock us. It encouraged them to hate us. So things turned from being a passive, we had sort of a passive relationship, to a hostile relationship.
With Hitler in power, Nazi-like paramilitary groups formed or reformed across Europe. In Hungary, Arrow Cross, a murderous anti-Jewish group, had existed since the 15th century. When the Nazis began to ransack Europe, Hungary allied with Germany, and thousands joined Arrow Cross, which in 1942 began targeting for death educated Jews like Murray's dad, Abe.
That was a turning point in our lives. That was the beginning of the end. I remember roughly at 2 or 3 in the morning, we had a knock on the door, and the 2 Arrow Cross fascists burst into our door, into our room, and they wanted to see my dad. We were all asleep. And when they told us, when they saw Dad, they told him to pack, to put his clothes on and pack his bags, whatever he wants to take with him, and follow them to an unknown destination. We were hysterical when this happened. We all wanted to know why Dad was taken, where Dad was being taken, and what the charges were. But they were unresponsive. My dad was an educator and a community leader. And what they did first is they decided to surround all educators and community leaders, to get rid of them first so the community remains leaderless. Dad was whisked away into the silence, only to be broken by barking dogs and whining wolves. That's all I remember. 2 weeks later, we heard that Dad and roughly 15 other community leaders were marched to the Carpathian Mountains and forced to dig their own mass grave. And then they were all executed. This changed our lives forever. Suddenly, we became vulnerable and very insecure. My mom didn't know what to do next. She didn't know how we were going to survive.
And how did Murray's non-Jewish neighbors and classmates react to the executions?
My impression is that they were glad because we were outsiders. They told us that we did not belong there in that community. We were treated as strangers. And if they took away another Jew or killed another Jew, it was a relief to many of them because it's one Jew less left in the community. I don't believe, knowing the mindset of those people in those days, I don't believe they cared.
Murray's famously lovely mother, Regina, was suddenly very vulnerable. As the oldest of 4 sons, Murray tried to protect her. But just 13, he was no match for the armed fascist.
I've only spoken about this 2 or 3 times in 60 years because it's too painful and I have a difficult time facing it. We had another knock on the door, and an Arrow Cross fascist soldier burst into our house and demanded to go to bed with my mom. I resisted it, and he took out a gun. And he says, if you don't stop it, he says, you'll be dead, and no one will care. My mom told me to stop it, and I did. Next thing I knew, I woke up at 6 or 7 in the morning. He was gone. My mom was never the same.
By the spring of 1944, the war had turned sharply against Germany. Confident that they could safely rely on the full participation of Arrow Cross, the Nazis nevertheless went ahead with their plans to annihilate Hungary's 1 million Jews.
Roughly April 1944, early morning knock on the door, and we were told to pack our bags and follow the Arrow Cross soldiers to the train station. Mom, I remember she pulled the sheets and blankets from our beds to put our belongings because we didn't have luggage in those days. Only the well-to-do had luggage. And we put pots and pans and bread and flour and whatever for subsistence. And I remember my mom tied all the baggage on our necks. It was a surreal scene that you only see in a movie. As we were trekking to the train station, it was an orchestrated scene on the street. Many of them are neighbors. Many of them we knew because it was a small community. We never believed that there was so much anger and hate and contempt for us as we were trudging with our baggage in our bags. They were hurling epithets at us, spitting at us, throwing rocks at us as we were led to our doom. Nobody came to our assistance. There was no moral outcry in the community.
Murray, now 14, with every other Jew in his town, was sent to a nearby city and into a ghetto created to serve as the temporary holding area. A few days later, Murray, his mother, and 3 brothers were shoved into an airless cattle car. For 72 hours, the train crept toward the death camp just across Hungary's border with Poland, Auschwitz.
Unfathomable. People in the cattle cars were wailing and crying and praying for salvation. We had no food and no sanitation facilities. People had to relieve themselves in their clothes. There were no sanitation. For 3 days, we suffered this dehumanizing experience. The cattle car smelled like a sewage plant. It was unbearable. Many older people died. The sick people died. When we got to Auschwitz, I don't remember how many people we took out of the cattle car dead.
Oblivious even of where or what Auschwitz was, most of Murray's group was designated for a same-day execution.
The door jerked open, and all of a sudden we were surrounded by the Sonderkommando, which were Jewish prisoners helping us unload, and they helped the Gestapo with various chores, and surrounded also by the Gestapo. And they started shouting at us in German to put the clothes in a certain area and to line up. The Sonderkommandos came up to the train, and they took off many, those who couldn't walk, those who were too sick, or those who were too tired. The very first thing we saw were the smoke-belching chimneys and the smell of flesh, and we knew immediately that something is going on here, but we had no idea.
These are Auschwitz photos of Hungarian Jews taken in early May of 1944, the very week Murray and his entire community arrived. It seemed that even those who feared the worst tried to remain as calm as possible and to comfort the children.
The young kids were less affected. We were more resilient than the older people. We didn't think as far, as deep as some of the older people. Mom was very reassuring. She was very positive person. I remember she would tell us, "Don't worry, I'm behind you, I'm with you, everything is going to be all right, don't worry about it, we'll all make it. Let's pray to the heavens." And she gave us peace and solace to the very last moment.
The last moment Murray would ever share with his family occurred within minutes after the family staggered down from the cattle car.
We were immediately separated. My mom huddled around my three brothers. She was sent to one side and I was sent to the other side. The people, those capable of working, the younger guys, under 30, under 35, were separated for work, for slave labor camp, and the rest of them were assigned, and they were told that they were going to take a disinfectant bath. And I remember a Sonderkommando told me, tell him you are 16. I was 14, tell him you're 16. He knew something I didn't know. If I was 16, they would assign me to work. And all I remember, the only thing I remember, my mom was hysterical when they yanked me away from her, and she bid me a farewell. The last thing she said, I love you, son. I hope to see you again. And that was the last time I saw my mom and my three brothers. I was assigned a striped suit. My number was 83,000. And I asked one of the prisoners, would you by any chance know where my mom and three brothers went? And he paused for a minute or two and didn't know what to tell me, didn't know whether he should tell me or not. He asked me to come out of the barracks, says, come on out, I'll show you where they are. And for a moment I was relieved. He takes me out of the barrack and then points to the chimney. That's where they are. This was roughly an hour after we were separated. This is how swiftly death came to these people. I said to myself, I'm alone. I have no incentive anymore to remain alive.
Like most prisoners, he would regain his will to live, but will was rarely enough to overcome their captors' commitment to kill them all. Inhuman conditions were the rule, beginning with barracks in which 500 were crammed, where no more than 75 could possibly have hoped to survive.
Three-tier barracks. We slept 3 people per bunk, so there were 9 people. The worst barrack, the worst bunk was the bottom one, because they took everything from all the incontinence and diarrhea and everything that came from the top 2 tiers. They were the receivers of all the indignities overnight. But we slept without blankets. We were given blankets. We were assigned blankets initially. It was so brutally cold that we took those blankets, most of us, and tore them up and made vests out of them. And we could not show those vests because we would have been brutalized by the Germans or even murdered. We took those vests under our shirts. And some of us used paper bags from cements where we worked in factories and made vests out of them to survive.
Each morning, Murray helped to remove a dozen or more corpses from the barracks. Then the night's survivors lined up for their guards to decide who could still work and who instead would be murdered.
They didn't count us. They knew that we could not escape. But the roll call, the purpose of the roll call was to cull the sick and the emaciated and those who are incapable of working. And they told them they were going to the hospital. Well, the hospital was a euphemism for the gas chambers. I was picked no less than 10, 12 times to go to the hospital because I was too weak and too emaciated, and I slipped back to the line because I knew what a hospital meant. My cousin, I had a cousin with me there, his name was Sam Green, and he volunteered to go, quote, to the hospital. And I said to him, Sam, do you realize that this is not a hospital you're going to? Do you realize where you're going and what you're doing? And he said something to me again that haunts me still. And my Hungarian name was Maurice. And it says, Maurice, I know where I'm going. I will only suffer for 10 or 15 minutes, but you'll suffer until you die an undignified death from starvation. He says, who is better off, you or I?
For the slaves of Auschwitz, death was usually gradual, horrible, and inevitable. Murray's body became skeletal as he carried 50-pound cement sacks for 14 hours each day. And acts of cruelty or murder could come at any minute.
I'll never forget, a sergeant came over to me when I was in Auschwitz, and it's the only time I was threatened with my life. He comes over to me and he says, Junge, was hast du aufgefressen, dass du hier bist? I violated the rule of answering. I said, gar nicht. And he slapped me so hard that the thrust knocked me probably about 20 feet from him. I was blind, bloodshot and blind in one eye and deaf on my ear probably for weeks on my left side.
Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and cholera killed thousands, though the biggest killer of prisoners was unrelenting starvation.
Hunger assaults your mind and the body until it becomes delirious. All you do is you hallucinate about food. It was impossible to survive on what they fed us. We were given a cup of coffee and a slice of bread in the morning, nothing at noontime, and at night a cup of foul-tasting potato soup. This was roughly 150 to 180 calories a day. The difference between those who survived and those who perished had a great deal to do with a mindset. There has to be an innate gift. If you believe in God, it may be a God-given gift. But it's a gift that I had to fight for life. And I fought for life every inch of the way, every moment of the day. I knew that I wanted to live. I knew that I wanted to survive. I knew that I was the only one in my family who survived at that point.
Deprivations at Auschwitz spared no one. So despite being a young teenager, Murray says he rarely got special considerations from his fellow prisoners.
You will probably hear different stories from different people, but my memory and my impression was that with few exceptions, we all became animalistic. We were all fighting for survival, and we became desensitized about each other.
By early 1945, Russian soldiers were at the gates of Auschwitz. Lacking time to kill and dispose of their bodies, the Nazis elected to march thousands of prisoners, including Murray Lynn, hundreds of miles to camps in Germany. Over the course of 10 brutal cold days, Murray fought to put one foot in front of another as the hateful Nazis committed murder all around him.
When I remember when we were marching on the death march, when the guards clobbered the sick people to death because they didn't want to waste a bullet on them. We knew that if we could just survive this terrible ordeal, that ultimately we would be liberated, but we didn't know how long it's going to take. We heard the planes flying above us. We knew that it's close, but we didn't know if we can survive long enough to see the daylight. It was an abyss of the worst kind. When I was liberated, I weighed roughly 60, 62 pounds, something like that. I was semi-comatose condition. I could not walk. My mind was barely functioning, and I was taken to the hospital, and I was fed intravenously for 2 weeks, which I was lucky because those of us who ate, who had access to too much food, died. Hundreds of them died because they overate. Their bodies could not absorb the food.
As soon as he could walk, Murray joined Europe's massive refugee population. He managed to stay alive for the months it took him to walk back to what had been his Hungarian home.
This is the same path that I took home roughly 15 months later, where an orchestrated gang of people were lining up the street, taunting us. Here I'm walking home on a dark evening by myself, with nothing in my hands. And what is cascading through my mind is, what am I going to do next if no one is home? What am I going to do if somebody is home? And when I finally got to our home, I knocked on a door, and a stranger opened the door, a hostile stranger. And he shouts at me, he said, "I thought you were all dead." I didn't remember him, but he knew me. And instinctively, I said to him, "I'm the ghost."
The Holocaust, Murray discovered, had made ghosts of virtually every Jew but himself, and he had no protection from hostile townspeople. Plus, now he had a new enemy, Stalinist communism, that was sweeping into Hungary and elsewhere and often arresting Holocaust survivors. Meanwhile, many Jews had decided to board ships for Israel, despite the inevitability of a war with its Arab neighbors. Murray, however, went to Ireland when a Jewish benefactor offered to transport him and other Jewish orphans for schooling in an old castle there. Less than a year later, the Irish government expelled them all for being Jewish.
Some of us would have stayed in Ireland. There were 2 or 3 families that wanted to adopt me in Ireland, Jewish families. I was a good-looking kid, and I was a charismatic kid, more so than I was now. I was full of spirit. And I had 2 or 3 offers to be adopted by wealthy families. They wouldn't let me stay.
5 decades later, Murray would return to Ireland with his best friend from his castle stay. The government extended them an apology for having forced the Jewish orphans to find another home in another country. That home for Murray turned out to be the United States, which welcomed him in 1949. Now, by almost any measure, he has achieved enormous success, by any measure but his own.
I'm happy with my children's success. I'm happy with my wife, my acquisitions in life, but I'm not happy with myself. There's a big difference. Because material things don't mean, I'm not a ostentatious guy. I'm not a grandstander. I'm not a guy that has to do something to impress people. That's against my nature, against my personality. So these things mean less to me than the ordinary person. This is why I said I never made it to the finish line, because of the personal void in my life. Not family void, but my void as a result of losing my parents young, of not having the love of my parents, not having the embrace, not having the security of my parents, not knowing how my life would have ended had this monster not intervened in our lives. This is why I have a void, and this is why I will always feel to the very end that I never made it to the finish line. My circle is not complete in that respect.
A few years ago, Lynn returned with family members to Auschwitz, where he read a deeply personal letter composed to his mother. Here's a small excerpt.
Mom, this vile and dehumanizing kingdom of genocide is now a historical bulwark against future barbarians. We are united in our resolve to never let that happen again. Your martyrdom was not in vain. We have solemnly pledged to never let the world forget our suffering, nor the abysmal fall of humanity.
That legacy continues to provide us lessons and warnings. One came in the spring of 2010 when the sign at the Auschwitz gate was stolen by Polish neo-Nazis. And the day after their visit to the extermination camp, the spirit of the Lynn family was terribly wounded back in his native Hungary.
As we are walking the streets in Budapest, a car pulls over next to us and a young man jumps out of the car. He must have been in the early 20s, and raises his arm and he says, "Heil Hitler," and jumps back in the car. And my daughter was with me at that time. And I said to my daughter many times when she was young, don't forget who you are, because if you do, someday someone is going to remind you.
To remind you. In the end, that's what Holocaust survivors like Murray Lynn say they feel compelled to do. To remind you that hatred, even in its most vicious and diabolical forms, takes no holiday. We must, they say, keep watch both on the world and on ourselves.
We must fight for a better world than the world of my childhood. You must never give up.
You know, the two low points in my life were when my dad was taken away from us in the middle of the night, and my mom's raped. I'll never forget that for as long as I live. My mom was not only a beautiful person outside, she was a beautiful person inside and out, loved by everybody. And when that happened, she felt that she betrayed my dad, she betrayed her faith, she betrayed her values, and she betrayed us. And she could never forgive herself. She said it would have been easier to die. And I'll never forget that. Auschwitz tested 1,000 times the limits of human endurance and our resilience in the face of relentless savagery and cringing servitude. What kept madness at bay was our fervent faith and blind hope for messianic redemption. It was our bromide, our opiate, that dulled the pain and brutal suffering. It lulled us into a state of frozen passivity, and complete surrender to the verdict of destiny. Over 70 years later, the sights and sounds of these nightmares continue to invade my life and my dreams. On a tranquil evening, when the clouds are clear and the moon high, I still see the silhouettes of the limping and grotesque skeletons marching in the shredded and dehumanizing striped suits on the cusp of succumbing to their cruel and inevitable destiny. And I can still hear the nightly wailing and shrill echoes pleading to the heavens for divine intervention. These scars are deeply seared in my psyche, on my psyche. It will forever and always be a stark reminder of a blighted creed and culture that turned our lives topsy-turvy. Prejudice is a social pathology with deep roots in a long life. No prejudice in history is as old, as pervasive, as enduring, and as visceral as anti-Semitism. It has survived in European countries where only cemeteries remain. It is a growing phenomenon in countries today where Jews have never lived. Religious wars go back to the Middle Ages. On the heels of the Crusades, the degrading yellow star became a symbol of contempt and vilification when Pope Innocent III decreed in 1215 that Jews must wear yellow stars and pointed hats as a badge of shame and humiliation. It lays bare the moral decay and corruption that gripped the continent for countless centuries. Our forefathers learned from these imperial abuses of power when they framed our Constitution not to confer to any religion or creed supremacy or sovereignty as a safeguard to religious freedom. And I thank God for them. My life was shaped by the crashing waves of history. It was tempered and honed in the crucible of Auschwitz. It defined what I am and who I am today. For 3 memorable years after my liberation, I was a lone and homeless teenage soldier marching and meandering across Europeans' scarred and poverty-stricken wasteland in search of a better and safer life. Without a mentor and financial resources, it took guile, grit, and uncommon resourcefulness to navigate through the gales and shoals of an inhospitable continent. My odyssey ended at the age of 19, when I landed in the New York harbor overlooking the Statue of Liberty that welcomed millions long before my time. Today, I'm an expression of American exceptionalism, rooted not in privileges of few, but a concept of meritocracy and equal opportunity. In a larger context, we offer the world an unprecedented role model of a creating culture blighted and oppressed that managed to lift itself from the margins of history to remarkable achievements in every field, every profession, and every walk of life. Here's a noteworthy take-home message for you students in particular. Inclusion and not exclusion is the hallmark of a free society. We must do much more, much more, to level the playing field for all Americans, irrespective of race, irrespective of color, irrespective of creed or national origin. Inequities breed resentment. Inequities breed violence. Inequities breed radicalism in all forms, including revolutions. In my native country, I was viewed and portrayed as a Jew first, and perhaps a flawed human being second. It was next to impossible to rise above the station in life into which you were born. This must never happen in America. My parents and their parents lived in oppressive and suffocating conditions without access to justice or due process. They were a voiceless and powerless underclass, condemned from cradle to grave to gasping hopelessness. It's an enduring reminder for all time that the greatest threat to pluralism and religious freedom are the apostles of purity and fanaticism who claim sole possession of the truth about how to live and what ideologies to invoke and embrace. And not least, the dangerous precepts that those who differ in their beliefs are subversive and evil apostates. In Europe, religious primacy was a de facto way of life. It spawned centuries of upheavals, expulsions of Jews from England, France, Spain, etc. The abuses of power were breathtaking. And by the way, there were no professed Jews living in England for 350 years. All the Jews were expelled. Very few people know this. All the Jews were expelled in 1290 from Great Britain. From at that time it was England. And no Jews lived in Great Britain during Shakespeare's period, and far beyond that, for 350 years until Cromwell invited the ancestors to come back. And this was true in France and Spain. All the Jews were expelled in 1492. None of them returned. Very few of them have. And that's a sad history of European history. The abuses of power were breathtaking. But we emerged from the rubble in mist to bear witness, so future generations can be spared the indignities and existential nightmares that we experienced. My narrative is true to Hollywood's legendary triumphs of good over evil. It's testimony to the limitless power of the human spirit to mend and restore what was broken, then soar triumphantly into the sunset like the mythological phoenix. And that, folks, is my narrative. Thank you.
us to ask if any question is on your mind related to this difficult and sensitive topic from anyone present today. So we have mic handlers. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And I'm going to repeat the question after you ask it, just in case Mr. Lynn wasn't able to hear it the first time.
Mr. Lynn, we have a question on the balcony to your top left.
Hello, sir. It's Cadet Gordon. I was just wondering, how did the survival characteristics that you had to obtain during the Holocaust affect your life after?
The question is, how did the survival characteristics that you learned in the Holocaust, how did those characteristics that you developed in the Holocaust, how did that affect your life after the Holocaust?
That's an excellent question. For one thing, it made me a little more secure. I think that insecurity was a huge problem. I'll give you a kind of a long answer to a short question. But let me elaborate on this a little bit, then I'll go in a chronological way. I came to New York as a teenager, as a student, and I was supposed to, from Dublin, Ireland, I was supposed to take a subway to go to college, and I couldn't take the subway for over 2 or 3 times. I got a cold. I broke out in a cold sweat every time I took the subway because it reminded me of the freight cars, of the cattle cars. I would never wear anything yellow because of the stars, yellow stars that we were supposed to wear. I was afraid of police. I was afraid of soldiers. I was afraid of authority. It had a terrible impact on my life to start with. And even today, when I drive my car and I pass a utility pole that has orange on it, I have a cold sweat, a burst of cold sweats in my back, because the orange pole reminds me of the black and orange band that the fascists, that the Nazis wore. So childhood traumas are never erased, and this is and really, I read all kinds of stories and reports of childhood traumas, and this is just one of them. But it made me also very insecure. It made me very protective, is a better word, of my family. I was also concerned, always concerned about insecurity about myself, insecurity about my family, insecurities of my station in life. And that had also a positive effect, by the way, sir. The positive effect was that it unleashed my yearning for success, because I was so insecure. I knew that I wanted more in life than I had as a child, and but I was very insecure and didn't know whether I could achieve my goals. So it made me work. I have spent probably 24/7 for over 50 years. I traveled all over the world for the company. It made me work that much harder. The negative side was I neglected my kids to a large extent in my family, which troubles me today. My son, and I mentioned this to the colonel, I believe, my son reminded me of that, who was a student here at this school for a brief period. He says, "Dad, you never took me to a baseball game." And that troubles me today very, very much. And that's the price I paid. I paid a high price because of my insecurities. But on the other hand, again, it was a driving force for me to achieve. And so that was my, that was the effect of my experience, the side effect.
Hello, Mr. Lynn. My name is Renee Gerald. I'm a teacher here at Riverside. I was talking with my students this morning about what I hope to learn from your story. They go, Ms. Gerald, what do you think you're going to learn today? And I said, what I hope to learn is how someone who has lost all of their family, all of their support system, finds a way to make a new life for themselves, to move forward and to build a family of their own. And so that would be my question to you, is how did you go about, as from being orphaned to building a life and a family of your own so that you could carry your family name forward and make a legacy?
How did you lose so much? You lost everything. And how did you come from that and rebuild your life to make a legacy for your future and for your family? How did you come and overcome that huge challenge?
I have jotted down a few notes on this, so let me share it with you. And that is an excellent question. And I have spent a lot of time on that to rebuild my life. And let me see if I can find this. Okay. I had to, when I was young, and I was homeless for 3 years, sleeping in parks, sleeping in barns from my liberation on until I came to Ireland. Sleeping in churches, I was absolutely homeless while I was meandering all over Europe to find my safe haven. So I came to the conclusion, I finally sobered up. I said to myself, what I learned from my experience, which was my turning point really in life, I learned that cynics don't change things. Believers change things. Idealists change things. Believers that dreamers change things. People who believe in the power we all hold within ourselves change things. And when I developed these sets of values as a teenager, and I used these set of values throughout my business career to get me from where I was in Europe to my present status. I've always been a fairly positive person. I've never wanted to give up. But in all, what made all the difference is having a set of values. And these set of values catapulted me. They were my trust. They were my saving grace that saved me from self-destruction. And many of, I have to tell you this also, many of the survivors have done exceptionally well for the same reasons that I did well. I'll give you an example. Two of the fellows that I came, we got 3 of us from Ireland, got scholarship to the United States. I was one of them. One of them had 2 PhDs from Harvard. He was a physicist, and he was shown on the picture. And the other was an MIT PhD. But all my friends were achievers, including Judy's husband, who was a lawyer. He too came from Europe. He was hidden by a Christian family. But we had something special to prove to ourselves. Not only was he a lawyer, but one of his sons was a physician, and the other is an attorney here who was a graduate from this school. And they're all achievers because we instilled in our children those values that we did not have as in Europe.
So the past had a lot to do with rebuilding our lives. It kind of unleashed our yearnings to change our lives. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, sir.
Right here, a question after.
Hi, Joshua Sullivan with the Times newspaper here in Gainesville. Mr. Lynn, I'm curious how much knowledge you and your family, right here, I'm curious how much knowledge you and your family had of the existence of concentration camps prior to being taken to Auschwitz, and also what knowledge may you have had while at Auschwitz of Allied efforts to liberate Western Europe. Is that common knowledge?
What knowledge did you and your family have about Auschwitz and the other concentration camps before you were deported? And then while at Auschwitz, what did you know about Allied efforts in the war to try to defeat Nazis?
We had no clue. Not only didn't we have a clue when we were in Europe, we had no clue what was going on even until it happened. When we were taken off the train, we had absolutely no clue about what's going to happen to us. They told us that they were going to war camps. And they have done, when I say they, the Nazis have done an outstanding job in covering up their plot against us. And in camp, we knew nothing. Because we had no access to newspapers, to radio, nothing. The only thing that we knew at camp is when, on rare occasions, a guard might have said something to us casually. But our only symptoms that we knew, the only thing that we knew or we felt is when we saw the British planes flying above the concentration camp, and we knew that this had to be close to liberation if we could make it. That was the only sign, that was the only symptom that we had about our future. Other than that, we had absolutely no clue what was going on.
Sir, right here.
Sir, I'm Mary McPherson, and I just wondered, I think you just made reference to a friend of yours that was hidden by a Christian family. Were you aware of any of your Jewish friends in your small town that were hidden by the other residents of the town? I know in France there were a lot of families that were in the resistance and that helped hide Jewish children especially. But I wondered in your small town if you were aware of anybody that was hidden and was protected by the residents of your town.
Were there any Hungarian Jews in your hometown that were hidden by the resistance or hidden by Christian groups during the war as they were in France and other places in Europe?
For some reason, not in my community. I'll give you an example. My community was a small community of roughly 30,000. Again, I can't tell you for sure. We had about 200 Jewish families in that community. That translates into maybe 3 people to a family, maybe 600 600 Jewish souls. When I came home after the war, as best as I could count in those days, we had 15 survivors out of those 500 or 600 people. All of them younger, or a year or two older than I am. None of them in our community, anti-Semitism was rampant. On the other hand, I have to tell you an ironic story. That in one of the most anti-Semitic countries in Europe, Poland, more Christians have hidden Jewish people than any other country. And that is so ironic, so strange, threatened their lives. I mean, as soon as the Germans found out about it, they executed those people immediately. So they took enormous chances to protect Jews. And this is true also in France and a number of other European countries. For some reason, Hungary was it's a staunchly Catholic country, and they embraced Hitler. They would deny this. They claimed they deny it even today. They claim that they were victims themselves. But I'll tell you a little story about that. The Pew organization took a survey of anti-Semitism in Europe 3-4 years ago, and they listed the top 10 countries in Europe, the most anti-Semitic countries. My native country was number 1, Hungary. Why? Because they had no education program. You would have thought that Germany would be number 1. No. Germany was on the bottom of the list. Why? Because they have a Holocaust education program that is very effective. You cannot deny the Holocaust in Germany. You cannot make inciting speeches. They're not concerned about freedom of speech. They're concerned about the safety of their citizens, and they have been very effective. So Hungary has not done anything about that. The second country that is most anti-Semitic in Europe was Spain. And that is also a mystery to me. It's ironic, because they have literally no Jews living there. They are listed as the second most anti-Semitic country in Europe. Again, they have no education program. Those countries who had education programs after the war about Jewish people, about the Holocaust, they have fewer incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, than, and again, Germany is noteworthy to mention. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, ma'am.
You are not aware of any in your community, so.
Sir, Andrew Pedri, I teach here at Riverside. My question for you, sir, is that the Holocaust set a terrible example that has unfortunately been repeated throughout the 20th century. How do we take the lessons of the Holocaust's memory moving forward and try to prevent these kind of tragedies in the future?
The Holocaust has been repeated throughout the 20th century in the hatred we see in places. How can we take the lessons from the Holocaust going forward into the 21st century to prevent it from happening again?
There are 3 answers: education, education, and education. And I also think that the government needs to do more than it's doing. You know, I value more than anyone else, given my background on freedom of speech. But freedom of speech must have boundaries, and at some point, I know not in my lifetime, but in the future, maybe 100 years from now, 200 years from now, I think that it will be modified and boundaries placed on freedom of speech. I repeat again that unrestricted freedom of speech teaches our children the wrong thing. When people who are hateful can go on the internet and spew out hatred, when they can go on radio and spew out hatred, in newspapers, when they can go to the marketplace, the open marketplace, and spew out hatred, this breeds negative ideas among our future generations, bad ideas. I think that we should have absolute freedom of speech. I believe in that more than anyone else, but I think we need to put limits on freedom of speech. When it threatens other minorities, that should be the limit. And just recently, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about Germany. They have put a limit on freedom of speech, where, again, as I said a few minutes ago, you cannot incite one race against the other, one faith against the other, one culture against the other. And it works for them. Why should it not work in our country? Why should it not work in other countries where they have problems with that? And this is the second thing that we must do other than education. But education is the key. There's no question in my mind. I've seen it happening here. This is why I'm so much involved. For me, this is very, very, at my age, this is very emotionally demanding to do what I'm doing. It's physically demanding. But I feel it's important for me to continue to do as long as I breathe, so you folks will hear it firsthand from a guy who's been through it. And this is our best hope. You are our best hope for the future, for a better future.
We have time for one more question.
Mr. Lynn, we have a question from the very center of the theater.
Hello, sir. My name is Mitchell Rodriguez. In the documentary, you mentioned your cousin who told you that he was voluntarily going to die and that he would suffer for 10 to 15 minutes while you would not. And he asked you, who do you think is better off, me or you? What did you think?
When your cousin told you that he was going to voluntarily die because it would be 10 or 15 minutes of suffering compared to a lifetime of suffering for you, and he asked you, who do you think is better off? How do you feel about the answer to that question?
Well, you know, it's against my characteristic to give up. This is why I'm still here. And he took what I call the easy way out. I hate to say this, but he took his older brother, when I was liberated, asked me if I have seen his younger brother, and I told him the story. We both cried. He could have survived if he didn't take the easy way out. That's my answer. But in conclusion, let me share one last thing. It will just take me 2 minutes. When I was in Auschwitz on the way home, my wife encouraged me to take my oldest daughter with me. And we took the plane home from Prague. We went from Auschwitz to Hungary on this educational tour. I was the keynote speaker for those people. And the Czech Republic. We took the plane home, and my daughter was very pensive, very emotional, very quiet, unusually quiet, on a plane, on the way home to Atlanta. And she said to me, her name is Roberta. Roberta said to me, Dad, how would your generation like to be remembered? And I said to her, honey, this is a very deep question, an emotional question. Can I write you a note on this after I deliberate on it a little bit on our way home and at home? She said, sure. So I wrote her a brief note after I got home, and I want to share it with you because it applies to all of us. Roberta, here's my answer to your question. Remember us not with lavish or brave words. Mourn us not with sorrowful tears, but rather with positive and engaging deeds. Strive for social justice. Work ceaselessly to safeguard our revered precepts of religious freedom and diversity. And not least, pay any price to protect the ideals and future of our nation, so we would never ever belong to a racist ideology that stripped our people of all hope in humanity over the centuries. And this is for you. May this message also be enshrined in your hearts, ennobled in your memories as a lasting legacy to future generations. And I thank you for caring to be here. Thanks very much.